I'm Damian Gillis. I'm a documentary filmmaker and a media producer, and the host of this series with the Canada West Forum. As a part of our energy series, nonprofit Canada West Forum Society today presents a conversation about harnessing the wind. In many places, wind and solar are the cheapest new energy sources. Large scale wind projects can deliver very low per kilowatt prices. However, costs vary by region, and grid integration adds system costs. Beyond its financial advantages, wind is a zero carbon energy source, something critical for our future. Today, we are joined by a number of esteemed experts in this field who will share their opinions, and we will offer them each the opportunity to make some introductory remarks in the order that I introduce them. And that will be followed by some roundtable discussion, and we will also take questions from the audience. You can supply those through the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them and pass them along to our expert guests here today. Dr. Jeppe Johansen is a senior advisor in the Center for Global Cooperation at the Danish Energy Agency. Denmark creates almost 60% of its electricity from wind, with much of the rest coming from solar and other renewables. Danish wind production is set to increase. Dr. Louise Comeau studies the social acceptance of renewable energy, transmission projects, climate change policies, and the energy transition, especially electrification. She is an expert in communications and public engagement. Patricia Lightburn is a member of the BC Climate Solutions Council and BC Director of Policy for the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. Ms. Lightburn has worked in the private sector, but has also worked in government and for the David Suzuki Foundation. And finally, last but not least, we have Pras Krishnan, who is an expert in technology, commercialization, and project management of renewable energy sources. He has been involved in renewable energy projects and sustainability in several regions of the world. He is now associated with Simon Fraser University's Clean Energy Research Group and is a principal of Surya Energy Consulting. We'll begin with Dr. Johansen. And please tell us a little bit about this tremendous success story of Denmark with renewable energy, and then we'll move on to our other panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. I have a few slides that I would like to share. So let me just try and share my screen here. Okay.
There you are.
Can you see now?
We saw that.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I have a few slides here just for the introductory 10-15 minutes about the Danish green transition and also some numbers on our renewable energy system.
I'm just going to jump in there and ask everyone to try and keep it to well under 10 minutes if we can, so we've got time for discussion. So yeah, like like 8 minutes or so there would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Carry on.
Okay. Yeah, I will just then I'll skip a few stuff, but a quick snapshot on how it looks right now, and then some historical slides on how we got there. I also have a generic timeline of the development and offshore wind farm, which actually gives a good overview of the different activities that are needed. And then I also have a slide on what is actually needed in order for offshore wind to be a success in emerging markets. But let's just start with the status right now. We have Denmark here to the right. And we currently have around 5 gigawatts of onshore wind, 4 gigawatts of solar PV, and currently 2.7 gigawatt offshore wind. We also have 1 gigawatt under construction, which is the Thor project. It's located here. And that will start producing, actually just did produce the first kilowatt hour now, but it will be in full operation by the end of the year. If we jump down to facts down here in the left corner, we actually have 88% of our electricity being made by renewables. That includes biomass and biogas. But if we only look at wind and solar, we are around 69%, which is 24 numbers. And even though we have a very high share of renewables, we still have a very high security of supply with, above 99.99% of the time. Renewables is obviously a very important part of the Danish society, creating a lot of jobs and developing a lot of industry. We have, we are around 6 million people in Denmark, but around more than 100,000 of those are employed in the Danish energy sector. And of those, 1/3 is working in the wind industry. And there is a lot of details we can talk about socioeconomic impacts, but a good rule of thumb is that having 1 gigawatt of offshore wind requires approximately 14,500 full-time equivalents in Denmark for developing and constructing such a wind farm. So let's move on. This is just a quick historical view of how we actually got there. We see here a timeline over the last more than 100 years with the post-war World War II effects where we had a lot of oil and coal in the Danish system. But after the oil crisis in the late 70s, renewables started emerging, and also some natural gas. And after the financial crisis in 2008 and the Paris Agreement in 2015, renewables have really accelerated quite a lot. And up until where we are now, obviously there is a lot of geopolitical challenges. It's important more than ever to become more renewable, more self-sufficient, and independent of fossil fuels from insecure countries. Let me just skip this one. Mentioning that, based on the geopolitical situation, Denmark is very long history of broad political agreements, and we have also been prioritizing climate over the last years. And in 2020, there was actually a quite ambitious climate act agreed upon in the parliament, where we, as a first step, decided to have 70% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. That was actually increased even more ambitious in 22 with the agreement of political goals, not an act, not a decided act. But there we wanted to have 100% green electricity by 2030, climate neutrality already in 2045, and even negative emitters in 2050. So there is a very long political or high ambitions of getting those targets. And also, as we are part of the European Commission, European Union, it's also fair to mention that last year they also agreed upon that they would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2040. They decided that last year. So there's a lot of attention on this in Europe. I think I will skip this one because we could probably bring it up if we're going to discuss offshore wind in more detail afterwards. So I'll just skip to the last one here, which is a lot of, a very text-intensive slide, I know. But it's a list of a lot of different activities that has to take place in a society in order to make offshore wind happen. First of all, I would like to emphasize that, there has to be a political will. Do the politicians, do the local parliament actually want this? Do they have a strategy of climate goals, of green transition? In Denmark, we have a long history, as mentioned, of very broad political agreements across the entire parliament, across political parties from left to right. And that is quite important. And then you can mention also on that one that, administrative processes, ministries working together, agencies working together in order to speed up processes on permitting, on other administrative processes is really quite important. There has to be a willingness to support the green transition. It does cost. We've seen that prices are very volatile over the last years due to geopolitical impact. Therefore, if the political society wants this, there is a subsidy need, a state subsidy needed. And that could be done in many different ways, but at least there has to be a commitment. If we go down to this one here, an important part is also a balance between production and demand, supply and demand. So if it's not enough, of course, just to have much more production, there has to be a balance either by electrification of the society or an active plan of how to export the power, either by power itself, but also as downstream effects like hydrogen or other Power-to-X products. Maybe I should stop here as a starting point, and we can get back to more items during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johansson. And that's a great primer for this discussion. And I want to pivot now to Dr. Comeau. And I imagine on your list, I didn't notice it there, but buy-in from the public supporting this program must be a big part of this. And clearly, that's been something that you've had a lot of success with in Denmark, and some of your European counterparts have. It can be a real challenge in other jurisdictions like our own. And so that brings in our next guest here and her expertise in how to message and talk about renewable energy in a way that gets people behind it. And what do we need to do here in British Columbia to get more of the public behind these kinds of alternatives compared to, say, carrying on with LNG development or some of the old school kind of hydroelectric projects that we're used to. Dr. Comeau.
Thanks a lot, Damien. And this will be a flyby. If you want to hear more about this research, we're actually releasing it tomorrow at a webinar, and I'll give you the link and also the deck at the end of this presentation. So yes, I am focused on how we get to yes. We do see a lot of resistance when it comes to specific projects and a lot of failures. This is our third kind of run at this, trying to understand what's driving people's responses. And we had a national survey in this round, 3 focus groups. We were in field in the fall, also a comprehensive literature review, interviews, and website reviews for concerned groups. I'm just going to show you some of the support for onshore, offshore wind and transmission. What we see is, let me just close this. Sorry, I've got this thing right in front of me and I'm going to hide. Floating meeting controls. Thank you. You'll see at the bottom, it's in the middle of the pack. Onshore wind, 60%, 59 and 46 for transmission. I was surprised by this. And we see quite a bit of distribution in terms of provincial breakout. In Quebec and Alberta, highest support for transmission. It's lowest in Manitoba, British Columbia, and New Brunswick. Nova Scotia and PEI, like onshore wind, the highest support for wind is in Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland is very close behind. Let me just get this here. What we also find is that when you ask people at a general level in terms of energy you rely on versus where you live, we see quite a drop, 18% in onshore wind and 17% for offshore, 11% for transmission. And what's interesting is there's difference in terms of sensitivities across the country. We see Quebec, for example, much more sensitive to near where they live, as well as PEI, whereas other provinces may be about half that difference. But you see a drop, and the goal is to recover from that drop as people evaluate projects. So we also asked why people oppose projects. You'll see here the standard list. You've seen it everywhere. It's the birds and the bats and the health effects and landscapes and so on. In asking other, people are concerned about the marine environments, aesthetic effects, and so on. But what I want to show you here is the difference in age. And we often see, and we'll see in my analysis, that older people are extremely concerned about projects and tend to be the most active in opposition. And you can see all the way down in bold for most of these effects that people over 60 are much more concerned. Interestingly, because a lot of our projects focus on exports, people don't want exports over local supply. It has to be dealt with. 50% in our survey said they are electricity should be generated from these renewable projects at home first, and that was very or extremely important to them. 31%, so a full 81%. 31% saying somewhat important. The question for them is surplus. You can share the surplus and you can share it in Canada first. Patriotism right now. People don't even want our electricity going to the US. So what is it that drives this opposition? I gave you a list of reasons people oppose, but they're often accused of being NIMBYs. And I can tell you the social scientists have said it's time to let that go. It's a simplistic, pejorative understanding. And depending on what kind of project it is, anybody, all of us could be called a NIMBY. And so we need to drop that. And so what is it? What is it that's driving this? And we do have a pyramid of social acceptance. I'm focused in the moment, this particular research on the bottom left, looking at questions of procedural distributional justice and trust, which is what is underpinning community acceptance. And I'm not going to give you any more on that till you come tomorrow. What is it though? We do need good engagement. We do need trust building activities, and we do need benefits. And our research shows that if you have all three, you can grow the fairness perceptions and you can increase social acceptance. But people really fail to understand that trust is actually part of their job, trust building, and that trust is a very complicated thing. It comprises 15 different dimensions at minimum, and it includes skepticism and general trust, and that when we don't pay attention to the need to build trust, we actually undermine our opportunity, and in fact, that is making things or your community or your project vulnerable to misinformation. We also wanted to look at community benefits and the contribution that they might make. People are open to it. And when they're thinking about these benefits, they're on the distributional plane. They're looking at, is it affecting me personally? Is it affecting me in comparison to others? Is it affecting future generations or the environment? And what we find is that when we ask people about specific kinds of community benefits, these 8 are from the literature. What we find is that, in fact, the interpersonal, how it affects me, is very important, but also more altruistic concerns like effect on the environment. We see that most of the community benefits that are offered by developers tend to be in the bottom rank, and not at the household level or job training is part of it, but it's in this bottom kind of community, social, land lease payments, and joint ownership. And I was surprised to see less support for that. Do community benefits increase support? Yes, they do, but in the softest opposition, if you will. So 42% of the sample said, yep, I like the idea of community benefits. The people who moved to increase support for wind and transmission were in the somewhat support or somewhat opposed category, and that's fine. In terms of neither increase or decrease support, it was 36%, so a high group. And what they said was, it's not that I don't care, it's I don't feel I have enough information. And so people are hungry. They want to know what's going on. And people who said that community benefits increase their opposition, it's because they don't trust government. So let me just finish up here with what it is that you get when you do your more advanced statistical work. A supporter believes that nature, the environment, and future generations will be protected. They think projects are fair or financially neutral. They expect personal benefits from those community benefits on offer, particularly power bill and property tax reductions. They're more trusting of government, and they think electrification is smart policy. But when you oppose, you're just in the mirror, right? You think there will be negative personal effects. You don't think the environment will be protected. You want those personal community benefits, but you doubt they'll happen. And if you're older, statistically, it's even more acute. So quick, just overview what we're talking about in terms of what we should do. People are telling us they don't know the story of why. What is it we're doing? Why are we doing it? What is it contributing to reliability and resilience? We don't highlight enough the benefits to environment and future generations, potentially. We're not countering misinformation early enough. And we could be sharing more stories from people who actually live with projects. We're trying to counter with all these facts, and this is not what's happening. It's fairness and trust. And so we really are proposing people have to see their job as requiring or thinking about their day. Did I build trust today? Did I build fairness perceptions today? And by being unbiased and transparent and accountable, fair dealing, avoiding overhyping projects, it's going to destroy trust. We see it in the data. Obviously, dropping not in my backyard claims and committing to best in class community benefits. We do need more research, and this is where I'll end. We do have the need for this figuring out what's appropriately funded by ratepayers versus taxpayers in order to keep costs down. We have to figure out how to address the material needs. Are we going to do big retrofit projects with new infrastructure like wind and transmission? We need best practice guidance on community benefits, but not from developers. We need neutral sources. We need to identify a broader range of benefits for transmission. We've got some serious resistance to transition we see in the data. And we have to figure out this issue of local supply versus exports. And I think it means a better balance between large projects and small. When we asked our focus group folks what they would give us as advice, they said, invest local, be transparent, do what you say, and get her done. And when you get the deck, you'll see the link to our technical report and a link to the registration for the webinar tomorrow, as well as some of my other data from the report. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Comeau. I'm going to just carry on right on to another local expert here, Patricia Lightburn.
Thanks. Okay, let me see if I can just do a quick screen share here. All right. Do you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Here we go. Well, first of all, just want to say, Louise, I'm so grateful for the research that you are doing in this space. We have so much to learn and so much to do, to your point. So all the guidance on how to get her done is so much appreciated. So I'd like to take us back a little bit more focused to the BC market. We've heard about Denmark. We've heard about sort of some national research. My world is focused on wind development and solar and storage in British Columbia. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is that we are already building on a position of strength. So BC has a long history of renewable energy development, starting with hydro, moving into some smaller hydro projects with Run River. And then we also do have 10 operating utility scale wind projects in the province, which many people don't know because they're located mostly in the Peace region, northern Vancouver Island. But we do have some knowledge in the province about how to build and operate wind projects and what the benefits and impacts of those projects are. But we certainly are on the start of a new chapter of wind energy development in BC. So after several decades of relatively flat electricity demand growth in BC, BC Hydro has said that electricity demand, like in most jurisdictions around the world, is projected to rise significantly, even over the next 5 years. BC Hydro projects a 15% increase in electricity demand by 2030. And in most jurisdictions, we see a doubling of electricity demand by 2040 or 2050. So there's a lot behind that electricity demand increase. Part of that is from electrification of homes, transportation and industry, population growth, and wanting to meet BC's electricity demand with BC sources of electricity. So BC Hydro looked at all the different options that it had for procuring new electricity supply and move forward with a competitive procurement to bring new wind and solar projects onto the grid. So they selected 9 wind and 1 solar project late 2024, which are listed in the boxes here. And another set of projects is expected to be announced in May of this year. So why wind? Why does wind make sense in British Columbia? For a lot of reasons. So the first thing is that compared to all of the generation options available, BC Hydro, as well as really every study that looks at costs of generation resources, finds that wind and solar, utility scale wind and solar, are the lowest cost energy resources available. So this means lowest cost to ratepayers, keeping electricity rates affordable for both consumers and industrial consumers who rely on that low-cost, reliable supply of clean electricity. Another advantage of wind is that it's very scalable, so we can bring on different project sizes and different locations across the province as needed, instead of investing in large sort of single generation projects. By now, it's a proven technology, so wind is not new. We have decades and decades of experience across Canada and around the world in operating these projects. We know what they cost, we know how they operate, we know how to optimize efficiency. Another key advantage is price certainty. So wind, like solar and other renewable resources, don't rely on volatile fuels like natural gas or oil. And so that protects ratepayers and provides that low cost, fixed price electricity supply. Emissions free, certainly climate benefits as well as local air pollution benefits. And what I'm really excited about is the First Nations partnership opportunity. So all of the 10 projects that were awarded contracts last year, as well as the projects that will be announced in May, have a minimum of 25% equity ownership by a local First Nation community. That was the floor that was set by BC Hydro, and in fact, the 10 projects more than met that floor with 49 to 51% equity ownership by First Nations communities. So that means these projects are co-owned by the local community where the project is going to be located. So when Louise talks about community benefits, this means that project revenues will be flowing to those communities for the life of the project, which could be 30 years or more. During construction, these projects also bring significant regional jobs, economic development opportunities, and municipal tax revenues. So we know that communities, rural communities in British Columbia, are facing some really challenging times right now, and additional sources of municipal tax revenue from projects like this that do not draw on local infrastructure like sewage or roads. You know, they're there. They don't have a lot of impact on that infrastructure. Those tax revenues can make a really big difference for communities in rural BC, as do the jobs and investment that comes along with these projects. So maybe I'll pause there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Patricia. We're getting some good comments coming through the chat here, so keep that coming, and we'll collect all this and get into our roundtable discussion shortly. Here we have one final panelist to present their initial remarks here. Pras Krishnan, take the floor, please.
All right. Hi, Damien. Thank you. Thank you to Norm and the Canada West Forum for organizing today's conversation, and thank you to all the other panelists and everyone for joining. Damien, I don't have any prepared presentation. Our work, I'll talk a little bit about our work, and then I think it'd be great to get into the moderated discussion. Our work, we work with independent power producers exclusively in renewables and 99% in solar and storage, working on any technical aspects of them implementing a project. And I think to the extent that those topics come up in terms of how we integrate such projects into the grid, I can chime in on more project-specific information, because we're working with individual projects, primarily in the US, in the renewable sector. I don't have a lot of macro level information to offer here in the BC context. Furthermore, all that is hidden behind several layers of confidentiality and NDAs. So what I'll do is pick out anecdotes and experience from, now I'm roughly going on about 20 years working on integrating renewables into the grid. So as those examples come up in our BC context, I'll be happy to share that and put that into the conversation.
That's great. Okay. Well, let's go. I'd like to kind of try and frame a question here that's emerging from a lot of people, and it's a question that I have, and I'll disclose the fact that I did a lot of work opposing and reporting on the private power industry in BC a number of years ago. There was a lack of transparency there. There was a very high cost to the ratepayer. We were talking about sometimes 3 to 4 times the cost of power production. it was privately owned, and so we have a historically public utility in British Columbia that derived benefit. My family lost its ranch on the Peace River years ago to create the Bennett Dam. I have other family that lost land for the Site C Dam as well. The one thing about those big, large-scale public projects is that they are owned by the people, and that the benefit derived to the public. So I think this is a concern. I think there is some questions around the procurement process, who owns it, who benefits from it. I'd like to hear from Dr. Johansson about what that model looks like in Denmark, and where the financial model and where the benefits flow. And also just the transparency issue has been raised in the chat here. So we have I don't know what the terminology is today, but they used to call it a clean power call. And BC Hydro would come out with a call, and they would go out at that time when I was really digging into this around the private power sector. It was negotiating with individual, oftentimes were hedge funds and banks and American companies that came in and were looking to get into this into the business here, and it was kind of new to the province at that time. So I'm wondering, for some of the viewers or audience here have suggested that there's a lack of transparency around how much is being paid for these wind projects, and I'm very mindful of Louise's framework here in terms of building acceptance. It really does rely a lot on trust, is what I'm hearing. I think that makes a lot of sense. There's fairness and trust. So if we're going to get there, I think that's part of the issue. And I just want to hear from everyone. We'll just kind of go around in no particular order here. Whoever wants to jump in first. What is the financial model of integrating these resources into our public system here? And what are some of and maybe we'll start with Dr. Johansson, actually. How does it look in Denmark? You talked a little bit about the government needing to step in and subsidize. What have you done that has worked there, and how has the public gotten on board with it?
I think it's a very fair question, and we have obviously spent a lot of time on local acceptance and local engagement. I think it's fair to say that the size of the plant is obviously quite important. If it's just a few turbines, a small solar farm, or whatever, then it's different. Historically, the first wind farms have been more or less decided upon by local communities. So where they each, local community going together, funding it, and then owning shares. So we have these local guilds that have made a lot of different wind farms, and based on some idealism, some green thoughts. But the bigger they become, the more power, finance, the more money there is in charge here. Obviously, the companies are coming in and making a lot of big plants, and this is where the local engagement are being challenged. I totally agree that the full transparency is very, very important. We have seen that engaging the local communities is extremely important, to do it as early as possible, to involve from very early planning, both from the development side, but also from the government side. And also making sure that the local population are being heard, so they can actually involve they can actually impact or affect how the wind farm would look like, where the solar panels will be located, and things like that. And then obviously, if there is a economic benefit, they can either take, we have different benefit models, or compensation models even, that have been decided upon or legalized, agreed upon. So, I mean, it's right now there is actually so much green plants in the pipeline right now. So the local acceptance have been decreasing. And there's a lot of people against having these huge energy farms or energy power plants, which is everything together. Big wind turbines, solar PV, it's storage, it's even hydrogen plants together. Actually, a fun thing is that the word or the phrase of the society last year was iron fields. There was a political party actually managing to introduce this term iron fields because they were very much against big onshore solar farms in the farm side, or and that so it is a very hot topic.
Yeah.
I just, before we move off you, Jeppe, I just want to ask, who pays? What's your model here? Like, you have you got a grid, right? And people at the end of the day, they pay a bill to a utility company, I assume. How do all these projects get integrated into that system for the ratepayer, and how does that trickle down? What's the ratepayer paying? For example, do you know as a comparison between what we pay? Well, I don't know if you know BC rates, but can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yes, so the process as it is now is that a developer sees a potential of building wind farms somewhere, and then they apply the municipality saying, can we put in a wind farm here? And then they negotiate back and forth that the developer obviously pays, but then they also have to pay for the grid connection, and the local TSO, transmission system operator, we only have one in Denmark, they are also obviously part of that negotiation. And it's actually the developer who pays for it, and then they sell the power per kilowatt hour to the government or to the local TSO. And you know, it's not very popular if it's the developer itself that takes all the revenue. Some of it also has to go to the local municipality, either through a green fund or a pay per kilowatt hour or so. And it's being negotiated from project to project. There is not a clear law saying that a certain amount of the revenue has to go to the state or to the local. And
the public knows what that rate ends up being in the final negotiation?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'm pretty sure about that.
Okay, I think, Louise, you had something you wanted to chime in here?
Yeah, just a couple of things. There is a saturation effect. It's real. And so this issue of place sensitivity, place attachment, context, historical, and issues, there's a saturation effect. But I want to give 3 quick points. The first thing that we make a mistake is we keep saying that this is the most affordable source of electricity. If you're a regular person, you think that means your bills will go down. And so we need to say relative to something else we might have done. Right? We need to think this through in terms of how people are reacting to it. And then a couple of things around structural barriers. This issue of community benefits is already generating jealousies and resentments because, as much as it's very important, we need to do projects in additional to equity, Indigenous equity ownership. Community ownership, energy democracy for all needs to be part of this story. Because if it's only restricted to one kind of group, I can tell you the data is showing me very clearly we're running into trouble. And it's expedient for developers, not necessarily the motivation that one might think. And then finally, there are structural barriers. Municipalities often aren't allowed to own a project, or there could be restrictions around community-owned power. We need to kind of unlock that and find ways to break through those barriers so that we can have essentially any option on the table: community-owned power, municipally owned power, large projects, Indigenous owned. We need it all. And that kind of fairness is really going to be critical.
I would argue too, like, as somebody who's participated in myself, I have 21 solar panels on my roof. I did that through the Canada Greener Homes Energy Program, which was a grant. It cost me a little over $20,000 to install the system, and 5 of that I got back from the federal government. and my payback is probably about 10 years, I think, according to the estimate. So I contribute to the grid. So I could have a battery system and be off grid, but it's a grid tie, right? So I pipe power into the grid when I'm not using it, when I'm creating a surplus, etc. So that kind of local, very hyper local, where individual homeowners and businesses, you got a roof on your commercial building, why not, utilize that? And that takes away some of the pressure of the transmission system, some of these other problems. And so I wonder if we shouldn't be, I don't even think that program is still available today. And certainly some of these subsidies seem to be kind of going backwards now, where we got on board with supporting it, and now we're sort of, curtailing it. So I'm with you on the local, fostering smaller scale local solutions too, Louise. Patricia, you've looked at this. You talked about community. I mean, this built on what Louise was saying earlier about community benefit is an important thing. We see this seems to be going quite well in terms of First Nations involvement in these. What are you observing with these recent power calls in terms of community, other community benefits, buy-in from the public? Are there questions about, as one of the commenter raised, about the transparency of the pricing on these contracts? So what can you tell us about the current kind of situation with BC Hydro and these wind projects?
Yeah, I would say that we certainly learned a lot from the previous round of call for power projects, where there was a looser requirement for impact benefit agreements or revenue sharing. It wasn't as clearly defined. And what we heard from nations was that they wanted in on the project. They wanted real co-ownership. And so that's been the focus of proponents, is responding to that desire from nations to be real co-owners and have an opportunity to shape the project location, timing, everything like that. So I think that it reflects a real evolution in our industry's thinking and approach, which I think has been really positive. But to your point, it's not just about the local nation that's the co-owner of the project. There are other communities, adjacent communities, projects and communities in the region who have a real sense of pride of place and belonging. And these projects will have, an impact one way or another. And I think that we and the province and, everyone involved in this transition need to do more to communicate and tell the story about why these projects are necessary and how they will benefit not just sending electrons to urban centers in southern British Columbia, but also power new mines and new industries that are close to those rural regions where these projects are being built. So I think part of that was because this increase in electricity demand, I don't want to say it took us by surprise, but it certainly was a big shift, right? We went from a long period of flat electricity demand, and then all of a sudden it really has been taking off. And so I think we're playing a bit of catch up. So we definitely need to get out there, and we're very much ramping up our efforts to get out to communities, to talk to folks about why these projects are needed, because I think that will go a long way in building support for when these projects move to construction next year. And then one other thing I wanted to mention on the affordability narrative, Louise, I think that's a really good point about, these projects, they are, more affordable than other options, but you also can't compare the cost of new supply to the cost of current supply, right? So Damien, you said, what is the price that we're paying in this contract compared to the price per kilowatt hour that we get from the grid today? But that price that we get from the grid is reflective of 100 years of legacy generation assets that have long been paid off. And it's more about comparing to what is available to us now on a go-forward basis. But most members of the public have probably already lost the narrative, as soon as the longer I talk about it, the less interested people are to hear it. So it's definitely a communications challenge for sure.
Well, I think it's a fair point. I'll just go back to what I know was the opposition at the time. So and I reported on this very granularly over the years, which was BC Hydro's projection models for future power consumption, and we had graphs that we published with an economist we worked with who dug into this. We're historically overestimating by 15 to 20%. For 20 to 30 years, we were always hearing it was going to be X much more, and then we would get to that point and it wasn't. And there was a couple of reasons for that. Number one, our industrial power base was hollowed out by the shipping of deconstruction of pulp mills and shuttering of sawmills and other large industrial consumers that used to be a huge part of the mix, right? We used to have roughly a third from industry, commercial, and residential. And that changed. We also had a lot more efficiency come into households and better building codes and other things that meant that people are now using LED bulbs instead of whatever. They're building to much higher energy standards when new homes are being built. So even though our population was going up, you would have thought that our consumption would be going up, but it wasn't actually. And it was now, I take your point that maybe we're at that point now where there's some truth to that increase. But what people were concerned about is if our focus is on conservation on demand side, we don't need to do it. We don't need to necessarily take on much more expensive contracts today. And every type of energy development carries an environmental cost, as we know, whether that be the birds and the bats or whether it be the mining of lithium for battery systems or whether it be these transmission corridors that require cutting through wilderness corridors and then suppressing that vegetation with chemicals or all the different things that are involved. Renewable energy still carries impacts and still carries cost, right? The only form of energy production that doesn't is conservation. And should be, in my view, considered a form of energy production. So if you're comparing new power that isn't necessarily required or could be reduced, the demand could be reduced by other measures, then it's a valid concern if this power is 4 times as much today. But I do take your point that if we are going to grow and we decide we want to have more electrification for our transportation sector or whatever, then we have to look at what's the best value to ratepayers today. So I want to offer Praz the opportunity to jump in. There's a lot of things firing around here, and just anything you want to jump on top of there.
Yeah, so we talked in this segment of the conversation generally about procurement and ownership models. There are some comments in the chat as well. And Norm has also put a reply to an earlier question regarding whether the public is provided the bid prices for these projects. That's not the case. And in my experience working on projects primarily in California and other sectors of the US, it's also not the case that the bid prices are revealed. Of course, that sparks another conversation and debate, especially here where it's a crown corporation, right? So in theory, our taxes are paying, so we should have greater transparency. BC Hydro does have one press release from last year, which provided a levelized cost of energy from all of the winning bids, and that was $74 per megawatt hour, but individual prices were not provided. There's also, so in Canada, in the Canadian context, Quebec is, I think, another great benchmark, the Denmark of Canada. No, and they're obviously a very strong hydro power. They've got they've just completed another call for power. They have more transparency. There's a report that I found, I haven't gone through it in detail, but released by the Règle de l'Énergie, and they talk about the bid prices, pricing for power that they're going to be paying for these upcoming wind projects at different capacity factors, et cetera. So that might be another data point. I'm not able to answer the policy question. I guess a few of us are on what BC Hydro and BCUC really do behind closed doors. The other interesting comment or sort of line of discussion was around procurement and ownership models. BC is very unique in that sense compared to other jurisdictions which I've worked where we've got the at least 25% equity ownership from First Nations, and most of the recent winning projects, as Patricia mentioned, were 50%. And there are federal government financing programs for the First Nations to be able to access that capital in order to, get into that equity stake, which is very unique, and I think there's a lot of potential there. In most So BC, we have a lot of the large generation owned by BC Hydro, the hydro electric. Just winding it way back, maybe it's time for a name change and not be called BC Hydro, and just let's decouple energy from that one source, right? It's obviously got a lot of controversy how WAC Bennett was built way back, and then even recently how Site C was built. It's obviously something we can explore there. In these other jurisdictions, for example, California has, and you'll hear me referring to California a lot, right or wrong, I'm not sure, but it provides an interesting comparison point in many of the conversations we're having. They have, I think they've got it worked out quite well. A lot of the large, like nuclear generation and everything, is owned by the investor-owned utilities, but pretty much all new generation is private development. Some of it is situated on public land. What they have, the federal lands, Bureau of Land Management at the federal government is responsible for administering the land, but the actual project is owned by private capital, owned and operated by private capital. And again, similar, no prices are provided in terms of bid costs. And I think pretty much all of these new procurements from BC are following a similar model, which is fine. I mean, there's obviously that dynamic tension between private industry generally is better at moving it forward faster. They're set up to do that. Whereas if you've got a government entity, it's just a stickier process to move a large infrastructure project through its pipeline, through its processes. So, but it's not going to do anything for a profit. It has to be for the benefit of the taxpayer. So there's always that dynamic tension between the two. We talked also about community benefits. I don't see it a lot in Canada. Several states in the US, for example, Minnesota, Illinois, possibly now Pennsylvania, and a few others, they have what are called, New York, of course, community solar programs. What these are, it's a bit of a, this would be great to have a slide for, and I apologize that I don't have that, but it's a bit of a multi-party agreement. You have a electric utility that says, okay, to solar developer, you can build a solar power project up to a certain size, 5 megawatts usually, and you can have community ownership of this. So what we will do is you go around to the community and adding individual households or individual people interested in this project as subscribers. So you have a third party now, which is a subscriber aggregator. They're actually the ones on the door, going door to door on the ground, acquiring subscribers. The utility has a program. So again, regulation policy is the key driver, right? Not the technology. The utility has a program where they say, okay, these community participants who are our customers, they can opt into this new program that we have that would allow them to get the benefit from this renewable energy project. So on the back end is where all of the structure happens in terms of where the energy is going, how much of that is credited to one particular family or community solar member's bill, how much is going to another member's bill. So they have that mechanism. Pennsylvania tried for several years to get something going, and I think they just recently have approved a community solar program. I'm not fully up to speed on the policy. That I think could be an interesting one for us to look into BC. There are some other comments in the chat regarding storage. Perhaps we'll get to that later, and we can address that as well. I'll hand it back to you.
I want to move on to transmission because that's a big issue here in a moment. But I just because this has actually been a hot topic here, the transparency issue on these contracts. I want to offer one more opportunity here. Louise, Patricia, do you have any thoughts on should the? I'm not saying that the negotiations behind between the company and the Crown utility shouldn't be done in a boardroom under some sort of level of secrecy, if you. I don't like that word, but the ultimate what the ratepayer is being bound to pay, what the winning bids were, all that information. Shouldn't a certain amount of that be transparent because we, the public, are actually the client. We're the buyer as the co-owners of a public utility, and wouldn't that help with buy-in and in terms of fairness and trust? Just last thoughts on this transparency issue.
Well, let me just, I mean, I could do a quick analytics of the chat, right? I mean, the words that are being used show you that that lack of transparency is undermining trust. I mean, why am I kept in the dark? Why is it secret? Well, these are competitive bids. Companies are competing with each other. So I don't know what the policy solution is, but lack of transparency is destructive. At the same time, these companies are competing. And so I'm not sure if other jurisdictions have sorted out what the solution is. Maybe it's the average price, an average price of some kind where people can get a sense of what it is. But you can see right away the language that results from it, and it's destructive.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, I think we could do a better job of describing what the competitive process is that results in these projects being offered contracts. So, Damien, you used the word negotiation. It's not at all a negotiation, in fact, right? Like every project submits a detailed bid submission with all the required information about costs and and partnerships. And it's an extensive bid that goes in, and then BC Hydro, without involvement of developers at all, evaluates according to a very transparent set of metrics, project by project, and how they compare to each other. And some of the metrics include, is the project located close to load centers where the power is needed? Does the project have that equity ownership by the First Nation? There's even additional points for broader community benefits for other adjacent communities and economic development opportunities. So every project is ranked according to those transparent same set of metrics. And then what falls out, what are the top projects? Those are what are awarded contracts. So to Louise's point, yes, it's a competitive process. So, there is some level of confidentiality with bid prices that go in. But at the same time, we don't talk a lot about what that process is. And maybe if we did that more, that would provide some comfort to community members about fairness of that process and more trust in the outcome.
Yeah, excellent.
You probably just did a better public relations job in 30 seconds there, Patricia, than what the public generally gets from this. So I appreciate that. And it's helpful. Puts me at ease a little bit more to hear that, right? And I'm sure for some people, a lot of people it would. And there may remain some misgivings around this. Praz alluded to this natural. There's a tension, right? Once you move in and you start bringing in different interests into one big system, there's going to be some tension there. I want to move on.
Last
thing. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please
do. Just what you said just made me think of something else that I think we also need to keep in mind in that discussion of private versus public ownership. Is the risk. So who bears the risk of those projects? And when you have private ownership for these projects, for these wind projects going forward, those prices that we sign in the contract or the developers sign in those contracts, those are fixed. And so any cost overruns or delays, that risk is borne by the developer, not by the ratepayer or the taxpayer. And we see that in comparison to public ownership of projects where there can be significant cost overruns. And one way or another, that comes back to the ratepayer and the cost and the taxpayer. So I think that distribution of risk is another thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the role of the private sector in developing these projects.
And that may be more fairly assessed today. I would say that historically what I observed is that that risk was so highly priced in that it wasn't really risk. It was just a massive premium. And what a developer would do is get a contract from Hydro, then go get financing on that basis. They'd have a 40-year contract, guaranteed contract, and that was the basis for which they were able to finance the project. So there was actually very little risk and a lot of profit, and it was baked into that model. So I think it really depends on what that premium is, that risk premium. If the premium is low, then there's real risk. We have a way of calling things risk that aren't really of minimizing risk. It's just basic externalities, right? We know about this, how this works. So, but I want to move on to the transmission issue here, and starting with Jeppe, because this clearly, as Louise's slide illustrated, this is a big, in BC, I saw that there's a 60% plus support for offshore and onshore wind projects in BC, but only a 41% support for transmission lines. And obviously, if you're going to build something out in the ocean or out in a remote location where the wind often is, unless you're in downtown Victoria, it's pretty windy. Maybe they could pull something off there. No, I don't think that would be very popular. But generally, we're going to have to run transmission lines somewhere, and so you need that in order for the system to work. And so you must have a whole lot of transmission lines running all over your country there. Jeppe, how have you guys managed this? And I want to hear from other people. How do we work out this transmission issue?
Yeah, that's very relevant right now. I mean, we have one transmission system operator, Energinet, who owns and maintains the entire transmission grid in Denmark, and they are obliged to provide grid connection whenever a wind farm or a solar farm has been approved. So they have to do that. That's part of their mandate. However, there is obviously a lot of requests from developers wanting to develop wind farms and solar farms, and our TSO cannot keep up with that requirements or these requests, so they are being delayed, and that obviously is not very popular. But I mean, back to the TSO, they are the ones that are responsible for planning the transmission system and build it, procure all the transmission cables, and also make sure that all the environmental impact assessments are being done whenever they make transmission corridors down through Denmark. So, I mean, it is definitely a very large challenge, and we have a lot of debate whether that's the right system in Denmark, because they cannot keep up with the demand, especially now with data centers coming in or power to X plants being planned and things like that. So it is a big challenge.
We had a question from one commenter here about forced entry, or I guess in America you call it eminent domain, or this issue of to what extent do right-of-ways for transmission lines potentially trample on property owners' rights, or is it forced on them? Is there is there some sort of process to work around that? How does that work in Denmark?
If the wind farm has been agreed upon and been approved by the municipality and the government, then the developers start negotiate with the land owners on whether they can dig down a cable, install a cable through their land. They have a certain amount of compensation that they should, negotiate a price. And if it's the government that owns the development project, then we start out with volunteer agreements and compensation schemes. And if that doesn't apply, then you can, at the very last minute, you actually can go in and expropriate the land and force the landowner to move away. I mean, so that is actually the case in some cases, yeah. But we definitely prefer to, negotiate a common agreement.
Would you ever say, okay, this farm, this would be really intrusive to their operation, and we could maybe divert this around in an area that's less controversial, but that's going to cost more money to the transmission company, to the public, I guess. Does that happen sometimes?
Yes, that definitely happens. I mean, if the negotiation with the local community, that they can come up with a better idea than the developer, that might cost even more, then they can agree upon that for sure. Simply because everybody has to be happy. The local people have to live with it, and the developer, they will also gain a little, goodwill if they cope with that. So yes.
Thank you. I want to bring this to our local panelists to talk about the North American and BC dimensions. I just want to insert a little anecdotal story. that I covered very closely. It was kind of heartbreaking, actually, in the community of Tawasin, where the BC Transmission Corporation wanted to upgrade the power lines there with these high kilovolt lines, and the community wanted them to be buried. That's all they were asking, because it went right over their high school, South Delta Secondary School. It went right over people's backyards, and they were concerned about EMF. And I remember I covered a rally that they held at the school, and there's all these kids and families. They were very freaked out about this. And this guy named Dr. Jason Ford, I believe he was, who was the head of pediatric oncology at Children's Hospital. And he came and he held up 2 stacks of papers, and he said, these ones say there is a problem with transmission lines and it causes cancer, and these ones say it's inconclusive or it doesn't. But he's like, as a doctor, my concern would be to take the precautionary approach. And if there's an additional cost involved here, let's pay that money and let's put everyone's mind at ease, and let's bury the lines, right? And yet that didn't happen. And they came in and literally bulldozed these lines over top of the community. And it was very upsetting and controversial. And there's an example of a large grid company. It was a Crown corporation, but were not beholden to take into account the concerns of the local citizenry when it came to that. So that may be just like a anomalous kind of horror story, but I have seen this. This is an issue in community. So what are we doing as we're proliferating these wind projects and other things? We're building out our grid. What are we doing to kind of balance the concerns of local landowners and communities when it comes to transmission systems in BC and in other jurisdictions here? Louise or Patricia or even Pras, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I could take a stab at this one. I have good amount of experience, developing building projects. Interestingly, another anecdote I could add is one of our clients right now, which is a solar project owner-operator in southeastern US. There's a natural gas utility that is essentially threatening eminent domain over their project in order to build a new gas pipeline. So that's kind of a David versus Goliath kind of story. Gas is basically saying, solar, get out of the way. We're going to put a pipeline here. So we'll see how that shakes out. So Denmark, Dr. Johansen brought up the context of the state-owned transmission operator. In Canada is a very unique, and again, I'll compare it to the US, which is a market I know better, but Canada is a very unique has a unique electrical infrastructure in that there is no national, grid. There's no national transmission. There's nothing. It's really all at the provincial level. So it's already a distinction. If we look at the US, no, there is no national grid, but they have what are called independent system operators or regional transmission operators, about 6 or 7 of these, and they are responsible for a particular geographic region. And they coordinate all the utilities and all the electrical activity at the transmission level in this region. So some famous ones for those in the energy sector is PJM, which coordinates Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. You've got CalISO, which is throughout California. You've got Bonneville Power Authority in the Northwest, so regulating Oregon and Washington State. Each of the Canadian provincial grids, more or less, has a lot of coordination with each of these U.S. regions versus within provinces. And I know in recent years, there's been a little bit of an uptick of discussion at the national level. I think there are some research studies that have been conducted into what it would look like to have some more transmission capability at the national level. I think realistically, it's not gonna happen on a large scale. It just takes a lot of time and effort to do that. You can look at Chile as another example where they had a lot of renewable growth. Let's say this in the early sort of first half of the 2000s, for 2000 to 2010, more or less. But they had 2 grids, effectively north and south, and there was essentially a physical barrier preventing interconnection of these 2 grids to allow for more balancing of renewable energy. And I think they've solved that problem. I don't know more details, but I believe they've built that connection. So that'd be another interesting anecdote to take a look at. For projects that are large-scale projects that are being built, sort of the typical approach is the project is assessed the interconnection cost, and it's built into its financial model. So the project is responsible for financing that, but they would work with the utility to build out the transmission. Let's say it's a 500 kV line from their project, but they've got to go to the nearest 500 kV line that's actually servicing the regional area, 5-6 kilometers or whatever. The project is responsible for building that cost, and they're responsible for working with all of the landowners in the middle. And I think this topic of eminent domain does also come up. I speak with colleagues and parallels in China, and we also speak with folks here in US, Canada, Denmark. Yeah, more or less at the end of the day, any government seems to have the right to be able to go to a particular piece of land and say, we need this for national interest, utility benefit, and we're going to take it. I haven't seen any place where that's not the case. So I'll stop there.
Hmm. Patricia or Louise, what does this look like in BC, and how well is it being managed in terms of balancing individual property owners' rights and other environmental considerations with sort of the need to build more transmission systems?
Yeah, so maybe a couple of points on that. It's certainly true that building out the transmission system will be critical for incorporating more renewables into the grid, and it is going to be challenging. BC Hydro has done a lot of work on the North Coast transmission line, and it sounds like their approach, as much as possible, is to bring in local Indigenous communities, again, as co-owners of that project or partners on the project. So maybe that will reduce some of the opposition and landowner rights that you're referring to. I think the other thing is that when we talk about an east-west Canada grid, our geography in Canada is just so different from a country like Denmark, which has such a greater population density, and it makes that kind of a network economic. Whereas in Canada, I think what we need to do is reinforce regional transmission interconnections. And when we can upgrade existing transmission lines, for example, the BC-Alberta interconnection, we can not have additional impacts to land and communities, right? If we look at those existing rights of way and look to upgrade them instead of create new lines, I think there's definitely an opportunity there. And then the last thing, which we talked a little bit about on the panel already, is the opportunity to look more at distributed energy resources and try and avoid some of those major infrastructure projects as much as we can by investing in local systems through generation and storage, and avoid some of that major transmission system investment. And I think the potential there, is really untapped, especially in BC. So we need to certainly do more of the work there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
often storage. I'm sorry, Louise, I'll make
Nope.
one comment and hand it back to you. Often storage is viewed as a tool that can help defer transmission upgrades. California, for example, has now something like 18 gigawatts of storage capacity available. And I haven't researched, but I believe there would be some information by now looking at what has been the impact on their planned transmission upgrades. Dr. Kumar, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, just to build on what you're saying, so I would actually tie transmission and storage together in this conversation, because both of these technologies, let's call it that, are really experiencing what I find surprisingly low support in the public's mind. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is they don't really know what it's for. And so for transmission and storage, we really haven't told the story of why we need these things and how they might relate to each other and how they can be used, in the storage case to avoid transmission, or how they might work together. But both of these technologies are victims, I would say, of a lot of misinformation. So I think that there does need to be a lot more attention to it, a lot more communication. I'll give you one number. There's a 20-point difference in support for transmission between men and women. You can imagine which direction it goes. And I think this issue of electromagnetic waves, the health effects, is much more of a concern for women than men. And so we do need a lot of much more engagement around it. And then finally, I did fly by on this point, but we don't really put on the table the same kind of community benefits we do for the generation side for the transmission side. And I think Acadia Center has done a very interesting report looking at US and Canadian examples of different kind of community benefits relating to transmission. And I think we just need to be more open to some of those opportunities, because I think the resistance is going to be very high on both storage and transmission if we're not really getting out in front of it very quickly.
Thank you, everyone, on that. I'm going to move to one last topic here, but I did want to just comment. One of our commenters made the point that we have a storage system here with our large hydro dams, and those are a backstop. They're a base load support that enables us. And I want to be really clear. There are some people from the Peace region here who are on this call that have sacrificed greatly, and in my view, wrongly, for the latest dam that we built. And well, that's a different topic for a different day. I spent a lot of time on that issue over the years, and I just want to acknowledge that was an absolutely, and there probably were other we know that there was research at the time that showed that wind and solar would have been more cost effective to the public in terms of the cost per megawatt than that large dam. And so there's been a terrible price paid by people to build those big reservoirs, which are also not green. We know the amount of or carbon neutral. We know the amount of methane gases that are produced by these reservoirs is significant. So they're not a carbon zero source. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because we have some people here who are very much directly affected by those impacts. All that being said, we have these reservoirs now, and they are a backstop that enables us to build more renewables on top of them, because it can fill in the gaps when the wind and the solar is fluctuating. I want to close out on what we're here to talk about, which is wind and the actual wind technology itself. Louise, you very helpfully gave us this framework of concern out there, the kind of resistance. I wonder, one sub question to this is, how much of the negative conceptions of wind power have been somehow sneakily created or infiltrated into the discourse by, say, oil and gas interests or other people who want to subvert this technology? How much of it is real? How much of it's being managed? You talked about, birds and bats and health and spoiling landscapes and property value decreases and noise is another one. And there's all sorts of things. So there are some inherent kind of some fears around wind. How much of that's real? How much of that's being tackled? Make the case, if you will, all of you, for wind projects and why they're actually a net benefit to our electricity system, to our carbon emissions, our planet, and our society in the time we have left. And whoever wants to go first, jump in.
Even though I'm a solar guy,
Yeah.
I think that solar and wind have long been viewed as siblings, complementary siblings. Indeed, yeah, there's data to show that wind is stronger at night in the winter versus in the summer during the day. So they're naturally very complementary. BC is blessed to have a very solid wind resource, and we should, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Damien. Yeah, it's a comparative analysis. It's not this good, that bad. So in the face of our alternatives, which are large, non-emitting hydro projects, but obviously extremely impactful, versus smaller footprint wind and solar and storage projects, clearly the environmental impact, the speed to build, all of these are favorable. The investment required, all of these are favorable for the smaller distributed projects, especially when paired with storage. And one point on the storage, we do have the reservoirs, we do have that system. It is good, but it's not necessarily a substitute for purpose-built storage. And that definitely has a role to play, especially if we talk about the Hecate Strait Wind Project. The website expects it to be 400 to 600 megawatts, which is quite large. And therefore, storing that and pairing that with the reservoir I think would be technologically almost impossible. However, if that could be paired with long form energy storage, of which there are a few companies out there doing that, that provides a better, I think, overall technical prospect in terms of integrating that into our grid.
Is that like a large battery array or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. So in California, they've got a lot of lithium ion batteries. And of course, that has certain pros and cons associated with it. We can definitely acknowledge that. Norm, perhaps storage is the topic for one of the future seminars. But one of the new technologies that's come out, it's called iron air battery. There's a company called Form Energy. And they have just announced, and that's founded by ex Tesla executives. And they have announced a partnership with Google and Xcel Energy to build quite a large 100-hour storage for some, I guess it's Google, so it must be some sort of data center. So something along those lines would be more appropriate for wind, where you need, if it doesn't blow for a few days, you need to be able to still provide.
Jeppe, you're the king
Yep.
of wind here. You're coming to us from the king of wind here, Denmark. What's being so attractive to, obviously some of it's geography, right? And but tell us about why are you a fan of wind, and if so, why?
I'm definitely a fan of wind. I haven't done anything else in my professional life. So, I mean, do you know what the biggest mountain is in Denmark? I mean, the largest hill we have is 180 meters.
Wow.
So we don't have any whatsoever hydropower. We have an extreme amount of wind, and that's so it's perfect for Denmark. We have the North Sea between several different countries, which is quite shallow waters. So there's it's relatively cheap to put up offshore wind there, and so this is where we are heading for. That being said, it's very important also to mention that we are very closely interconnected with our neighboring countries. We have several interconnectors to Sweden, to Norway, to Germany, to Poland, to the Netherlands, and even to UK. So that is, we usually say that Norway is our storage. We have a lot of hydropower in Norway. We have nuclear and in Sweden. We have a lot of natural gas in Germany. So yes, we do have storage, but not in Denmark. We trade the power back and forth.
Right. We have a similar situation here. We have historically with Alberta and Washington, et cetera, with dams, and historically with coal-fired plants in Alberta, which needed to keep running overnight when the power demand was low, and so we would shut our dams off and buy that power, et cetera. As to the conceptions that we've heard, that wind projects are bad for birds and bats, and that they are noisy, and all these. How have you observed that, and what do people think in Denmark about that stuff?
I mean, that's obviously something that you have to take very seriously. Yes, it does affect it, but it might be not that big. However, if the public and the NGOs and the environmental NGOs, they believe it, they obviously have to carry out science in order to prove it. But again, to the benefit of the doubt, you have to take it seriously. So there is always a matter of some kind of resistance against that. So my point is actually that the more you communicate and the earlier you communicate, the better. You have to provide proper research, facts, and then communicate, teach, educate the public in order to understand what is, and also to talk a lot about what are the alternatives. In Denmark, there's a lot of discussion right now that based on the new small modular reactor potential, that we should probably open up that can of worms again. My personal opinion is that that's not going to happen because we are extremely immature regarding nuclear on public acceptance, on environmental acceptance, and on regulation, on policies, on everything. So instead of talking about something that might be an idea in mid-40s, then we have a very low hanging fruit in Denmark, which is wind, and to some extent also onshore solar. But nuclear, fine, but not in Denmark. But sorry, yes, back to your point about the environmental issues. Yes, we definitely have to take that very seriously.
I want to close out with our local speakers here and talk about a little bit. First of all, are we messaging this? How is this, Patricia? You talked about the most recent call. It was in 2024, purchasing 9 wind contracts here, and there's more to come in May this year. What's the public response like right now in BC to wind? And are you seeing generally more buy-in, or is there just a lack of knowledge? Or is there some potential pushback coming? What do we need to do to mitigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I've seen on the ground really reflects the research of Louise and her team, which is that British Columbians are very supportive of wind conceptually, but when it comes to what happens in their backyard, they definitely have questions or concerns. But I would say that it isn't opposition yet. And so it's really on us, policymakers, industry, civil society in general, as was said, to take those concerns seriously and to listen and engage in conversations. And I suspect that as an industry, we've relied so long on the fact that we're emissions free and therefore we are better than everything. And so that just should give us a free pass, which is absolutely not the case, right? Like it's on us to listen and respond to those concerns and talk about the trade-offs. It's always this versus that. I don't think doing nothing is an option. We want our economy to grow. We want to electrify our economy to get ahead of climate change as much as possible. So having those conversations, we certainly need to do more of it. And I think the year ahead is really critical because this is when projects will be going through the permitting process and moving to construction next year. So we have started some more public engagement. We launched an initiative called Wind and Solar BC. So you can take a look at that, and certainly need to do more to talk to communities about these projects. So, with you on that.
Thank you. And before I hand it off to Louise for the final word here, I just want to we had some questions about where are these projects being developed? We talked about Northeast BC. We've heard about Hecate Strait. What is the generally, or I know North Vancouver Island is in the mix there. Can you just quickly fill our viewers in? Where is these wind projects coming to in BC?
Sure. So the best wind resource is definitely in the Peace region. Northern Vancouver Island is another hotspot, but we know that most load centers, electricity demand is located further south. So BC Hydro has also been encouraging projects to locate in the southern interior. So that's where we see projects around Merritt, Kelowna, Logan Lake, solar and wind. And I expect to see, more projects of the southern interior in the next round as well as the Peace and around Prince George and Northern Vancouver Island.
Dr. Comeau, any final thoughts? How are we doing here? What do we need to do big picture going forward here to realize the potential benefits of low carbon wind energy in our socioeconomic situation here in BC?
We really, really have to commit to energy democracy. People want to participate in this energy transition. And so we need to show people the respect that they deserve. And if we start from that premise and we build relationships for the long term, we're going to be able to get through this. But it can't happen if it's a top-down process. It's got to really be an exchange, a respectful exchange that's built on trust and fairness.
Well, I thank you all for this respectful exchange that I think we had today, and a lot of important information that came out. I hope that we were able to answer, I think, a good chunk of the questions and comments and concerns that came from our audience. And I appreciate everyone's time here today. I'd like to invite our audience here to stay tuned for additional forums about energy. After an examination of solar, we will look at geothermal, distributed energy sources, and perhaps most importantly, as I alluded to earlier, conservation. And I want to just thank our organizers here today, Norm and the Canada West Forum team for hosting us and creating this important forum for discussion about a range of topics that are critical to our future here in British Columbia and beyond. And I just want to encourage everyone to continue joining the Canada West Forum and contributing as you have here today to make this forum stronger as we go forward. Thank you very much, and we'll see you guys next time.